Canada is starting a dispute resolution process against Stellantis after the automaker announced it's moving jobs south of the border.
The industry minister, Melanie Joly, says today's action is based on the belief that automaker Stellantis did violate the billion-dollar contract signed with the federal government.
A seismic shift has hit Illinois, and the story behind it is far more nuanced than the headlines suggest. When Stellantis announced that Jeep Compass production would move from Canada to Belvidere, Illinois, political leaders hailed it as a victory for American manufacturing. A $13 billion expansion plan was unveiled, promising jobs, renewed pride, and the revival of the industrial heartbeat of the Midwest. Cameras flashed. Handshakes were exchanged. Optimism swept through press conferences, signaling what appeared to be a triumphant return of domestic manufacturing. But beneath the smiles and speeches, the reality was far more complicated. Costs were escalating. Steel and aluminum prices surged in response to new tariffs. Transportation expenses rose sharply, and the market for gas-powered vehicles began to shrink faster than anyone anticipated. The very policies intended to protect American industry were now straining it. Inside factories, the initial optimism started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Workers and business owners began realizing that the much-publicized comeback might carry a price heavier than anyone expected. For years, the auto industry had been told the era of tariff turbulence was over, that stability had returned. Yet for many, uncertainty persisted. Small suppliers across the Midwest, often the most vulnerable links in the chain, struggled to absorb rising costs. One Detroit-based company announced layoffs and the closure of a warehouse, citing the new trade environment as unsustainable. Soon after, Stellantis itself paused production at 2 U.S. plants, directly attributing the decision to the impact of President Trump's tariffs. For thousands of American workers who had endured years of layoffs and pay freezes, this was a stark reminder that the promised industrial revival might not be as secure as political rhetoric suggested. What began as a patriotic push to restore domestic manufacturing quickly turned into a fight for survival. The dream of bringing jobs back home began to blur into economic complexity. Questions shifted from whether America could build cars again to whether it could afford to do so. When Stellantis revealed that tariffs had already cost the company nearly $480 million Canadian dollars, the depth of the issue became clear. Executives warned that if conditions persisted, the yearly financial impact could rise to $2.4 billion, a figure that threatened not only profitability, but also the very sustainability of operations in the U.S. The math was simple, but brutal. Each new tariff added a layer of cost. Every retaliatory measure from trading partners amplified the burden. Analysts describe the phenomenon as tariff stacking, when overlapping duties accumulate on the same goods until total rates become suffocating. In some cases, cumulative tariffs approached nearly 38%, making it almost impossible for automakers to maintain profitable production. By mid-2025, Volkswagen had already absorbed $1.3 billion in similar costs, forcing a reduction in projected profits. Stellantis followed with a $2.3 billion net loss, canceling several planned U.S. investments and issuing warnings to shareholders about their exposure to trade penalties. What had started as a patriotic endeavor to rebuild domestic manufacturing was colliding with the hard realities of global economics. Modern cars are not simply vehicles, they are global machines. Approximately 40% of their value derives from electronic components, with another 20% coming from internal combustion engines, both categories highly sensitive to tariffs. Every new fee on imported chips, wiring, or powertrains rippled throughout the entire supply chain, inflating costs long before vehicles reached dealerships. The policies meant to protect domestic manufacturing were, in effect, taxing it. Profit margins tightened, investment slowed, and the expansion plans that had been hailed as a comeback began to stall. The true impact extended far beyond the balance sheets. In towns built around the auto trade, the consequences were tangible. Belvedere, once a symbol of round-the-clock production and over 5,000 workers in 2019, faced a leaner reality. By 2022, employment had already fallen, and the reopening plan promised fewer positions than the plant had historically maintained. Local businesses dependent on factory workers, restaurants, mechanics, and retailers felt the hit immediately. In nearby Rockford, unemployment climbed to 7.8%, the highest rate among Illinois' major metropolitan areas. When Stellantis announced 400 additional white-collar job cuts across the U.S. in 2024, it became evident that these measures were not temporary adjustments. The company was reshaping itself for a leaner, less predictable era. Even competitors were not immune. Hyundai and Genesis scaled back service incentives rather than raise prices, signaling that the pressure had already reached the consumer level. What had started as a factory problem was now rippling through dealerships, suppliers, and households. The slowdown was no longer confined to a single company or region. It threatened the broader ecosystem that had supported North America's industrial power for generations.
As the U.S. grappled with the fallout from tariff-driven policies, the magnitude of the financial strain became impossible to ignore. Stellantis' pause in production at key plants revealed that the promised revival of American manufacturing was encountering unexpected friction. Tariffs, originally intended to shield domestic factories, were creating a paradox. While protecting some jobs, they simultaneously inflated costs, eroded profit margins, and forced companies to rethink expansion plans. The situation was particularly acute in the realm of tariff stacking, where overlapping duties compounded costs on the same products. Combined rates in some cases approached nearly 38%, leaving automakers in a precarious position. Each imported component, from advanced electronic chips to wiring harnesses and internal combustion engines, became a financial minefield. Analysts noted that this environment made it nearly impossible for firms to maintain profitable production lines. Volkswagen had already absorbed $1.3 billion in similar costs by mid-2025, forcing a downward revision of profit expectations. Stellantis' subsequent $2.3 billion net loss underscored a critical point. Tariffs alone cannot rebuild an industry if they simultaneously threaten its foundations. The economic tremors were felt far beyond factory walls. Suppliers, small businesses, and local economies dependent on the auto industry faced mounting uncertainty. Midwest towns, long reliant on the steady hum of assembly lines, were suddenly contending with layoffs, halted production, and diminished investment. Each job cut created a ripple effect: missed mortgage payments, deferred purchases, and shuttered local shops. The so-called Made in America resurgence, while headline-grabbing, was revealing its hidden costs. Meanwhile, the decline in gas-powered vehicle demand added another layer of pressure. Consumers were increasingly shifting toward electric vehicles, leaving traditional internal combustion models vulnerable. Factories built for older technologies now faced idle lines and diminishing returns. The very policies designed to protect U.S. automakers from global competition inadvertently collided with the market's rapid evolution. As factories struggled, the financial vulnerability spread to dealerships. Hyundai and Genesis, for instance, scaled back incentives rather than increase prices, signaling that cost pressures were reaching the consumer level. Even well-capitalized competitors could not escape the ramifications of a disrupted supply chain. What had begun as a localized factory issue was rapidly morphing into a systemic challenge affecting the broader North American automotive ecosystem. The human impact was equally stark. In Belvedere, once a symbol of industrial vitality with 3 full shifts and over 5,000 workers, the reopening plan promised fewer positions than the plant's historic employment levels. Nearby Rockford faced 7.9% unemployment, the highest among major Illinois metros. When Stellantis announced 400 white-collar job cuts in 2024, it became clear that this was more than a temporary disruption. It marked a strategic recalibration for an uncertain future. In this climate, corporate caution was not limited to Stellantis. Automakers across the continent were recalibrating expansion plans, reassessing investments, and delaying hiring. The pressure from tariffs was exacerbated by the changing market for vehicles and components. Analysts warned that without structural adjustments, the long-term effects could weaken America's competitive position in global manufacturing. While the U.S. auto industry wrestled with these compounding challenges, Canada was quietly implementing a different approach. Ottawa refrained from retaliatory measures that mirrored Washington's tariffs. Instead, it structured its incentives to create stability and accountability. Subsidies for automakers were tied to enforceable commitments. Companies receiving public support were legally obliged to maintain jobs or invest in equivalent positions, or face significant penalties. This marked a shift from persuasion to enforcement, a clear message that public support was no longer discretionary but contractual. Prime Minister Mark Carney publicly attributed Stellantis's decision to relocate production south to American tariff escalation, but avoided escalation himself. His focus remained on accountability rather than conflict. Industry Minister Melanie Joly reinforced this stance, emphasizing that Canada would use every tool available, including legal measures, to ensure corporations honored their commitments to workers. The federal government's strategy extended beyond punitive measures, blending fiscal discipline with forward-looking industrial policy. Ottawa's approach was complemented by a broader framework designed to stabilize the workforce while preparing for the future of manufacturing. A $450 million retraining initiative aimed to help 50,000 workers transition into advanced manufacturing roles. The curriculum was tailored to meet the demands of emerging industries, ensuring that skilled labor remained relevant in a rapidly evolving market. Simultaneously, a $5 billion strategic response fund was created to assist businesses in diversifying operations and remaining competitive. Small and medium-sized suppliers, often the most vulnerable, received expanded regional support, doubling existing programs over 3 years. For workers caught between layoffs and retraining, employment insurance was extended by 20 weeks, allowing benefits up to 65 weeks for approximately 190,000 long-term employees. The intent was not merely to provide relief, but to maintain a skilled labor force ready to support the next generation of manufacturing. This carefully coordinated approach signaled a commitment to resilience, not short-term appeasement, and distinguished Canada's response from the U.S.'s reactive, tariff-driven model.
Canada didn't just stop at stabilizing the workforce. The government recognized that the future of manufacturing lay in electrification, battery production, and advanced mobility technologies. Unlike the U.S., which focused primarily on preserving legacy gas-powered plants, Ottawa viewed electric vehicles as infrastructure, the backbone of the next industrial era. At the center of this strategy was Nextstar Energy, a joint venture between Stellantis and LG. The project received up to $15 billion in production incentives, signaling Canada's commitment to not only retain industrial capacity but to transform it. The $5 billion battery complex in Windsor, completed in October 2025, was designed to produce nearly 50 gigawatt-hours of batteries annually, employing more than 2,500 workers, many of whom had been retrained from shuttered auto plants. This initiative didn't merely replace jobs, it upskilled a workforce prepared to lead in cutting-edge industries. A few hours away, Volkswagen's PowerCo broke ground on a $20 billion facility in St. Thomas, positioning Canada as a central hub in the emerging North American EV supply chain. Together, these investments signaled a profound shift. Canada was no longer a branch plant economy dependent on foreign decision-making. Instead, it was establishing itself as a self-sustaining industrial hub with strategic autonomy and long-term resilience. Ontario and the federal government reinforced this commitment with an additional $500 million in funding and $1.3 billion in long-term incentives to anchor suppliers and develop critical supporting infrastructure. The goal was clear: to ensure Canada retained domestic capability while building a competitive advantage in global supply chains. This approach stood in contrast to the U.S.'s tariff-driven strategy. Washington's $13 billion Made in America plan was headline-friendly and aimed to reignite domestic manufacturing pride. Yet tariffs alone created friction and uncertainty, leading companies to hesitate in committing resources. By contrast, Canada's structured incentives provided predictability. Corporations knew exactly what was expected and what they would gain in return. This wasn't about immediate gains, but sustainable growth. The broader implications of this shift were already becoming apparent. Modern vehicles are global products. Around 40% of their value comes from electronics and 20% from internal combustion engines. Both categories are extremely sensitive to tariffs. Every restriction on chips, wiring, or powertrains had a cascading effect on production costs, profitability, and the supply chain. By contrast, Canada's measured incentives and legal accountability created a secure environment for innovation and investment. The long-term vision extended to smaller suppliers and regional economies. Programs supporting SMEs, doubling in value from $450 million to $1 billion over 3 years, ensured that even the most vulnerable links in the supply chain could withstand market disruptions. For individual workers, extended employment insurance ensured continuity during industrial transitions, keeping talent connected to the economy until emerging sectors could absorb them. Canada's EV strategy also positioned the nation competitively against U.S. policy. The Windsor battery plant and the St. Thomas facility allowed Canada to develop a vertically integrated EV ecosystem, controlling not just production but critical supply chains. Ottawa's framework turned disruption into opportunity, aligning industrial policy with the future of global transportation. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued grappling with the consequences of protectionist measures. Higher tariffs on medium and heavy-duty trucks and buses, announced as of November 1, 2025, introduced up to 25% duty on trucks and 10% on buses. Vehicles built under the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement were partially exempt, but the tariffs on non-American parts created additional costs for manufacturers. Companies like Edison Motors, based in Golden, British Columbia, warned that each truck could carry up to $100,000 in added expenses, potentially pricing Canadian-made trucks out of the U.S. market. For the 20,000 Canadians employed in heavy-duty truck and bus manufacturing, these new tariffs threatened not only jobs but local economic stability. Towns built around these plants faced heightened uncertainty as households, suppliers, and service providers all relied on the continued flow of trade. Analysts warned that if such policies persisted, smaller sectors could face collapse, eroding decades of industrial integration in North America. In contrast, Canada's approach blended discipline, foresight, and strategic investment. Tariffs weren't the primary tool. Instead, enforceable incentives, retraining programs, and infrastructure investment created an industrial ecosystem capable of weathering global volatility. Where U.S. relied on pressure, Canada relied on patience, accountability, and planning. One built walls, the other built foundations. By mid-2025, the contrast between the two strategies was unmistakable. While American factories struggled under the weight of tariffs, delayed expansion, and rising costs, Canada was quietly solidifying its position as a resilient industrial power.
The long-term payoff was clear: a self-sustaining manufacturing sector, an EV battery supply chain of global relevance, and a workforce prepared for the next generation of industry. As the dust settled, one question loomed large: which path leads to lasting power? The reactive, high-pressure approach of tariffs, or Canada's deliberate, future-focused strategy? The answer, increasingly, appeared to favor the latter.
While Canada meticulously charted its industrial future, the U.S. tariff-driven revival was already straining North American auto industries. What began as a patriotic push to bring jobs home was colliding with rising steel and aluminum costs, higher transportation fees, and shrinking demand for gas-powered vehicles. Stellantis alone reported $480 million Canadian in losses due to tariff stacking, warning of annual exposure up to $2.4 billion if policies persisted, forcing cuts, delayed investments, and temporary plant closures. Volkswagen faced similar pressure, absorbing $1.3 billion in costs by mid-2025 and revising profit expectations downward. Canada's approach, in contrast, emphasized strategic discipline and accountability. Subsidies were tied to enforceable obligations. Companies had to maintain jobs, invest in local supply chains, and deliver on production promises. Facilities like Nexstar Energy in Windsor and Volkswagen's St. Thomas plant became cornerstones of a high-tech EV ecosystem, creating thousands of jobs and transforming Canada into a global hub for electrification and advanced vehicle production. These investments didn't merely replace lost positions, they reshaped Canada's industrial identity from a branch plant economy to a self-sustaining, forward-looking manufacturing powerhouse. The difference between approaches could not be clearer. In the U.S., tariffs added layers of cost, squeezing margins, slowing production, and creating uncertainty for truck and bus manufacturers. Edison Motors in British Columbia warned that each heavy-duty vehicle now faced up to $100,000 in additional expenses, threatening exports to the U.S. Meanwhile, small and medium-sized suppliers in Canada were supported through expanded regional programs, retraining initiatives, and employment insurance extensions, ensuring skilled labor remained integrated into the economy. Canada's strategy created predictability. Corporations could plan expansions with confidence, knowing that public support was structured and enforceable. The U.S. relied on tariffs to pressure companies, while Canada used incentives and accountability to encourage growth. This contrast extended beyond economics. Nations controlling EV battery production and supply chains gained strategic influence over the global industrial landscape, setting the pace, price, and direction of future trade. By late 2025, Canada's approach was delivering tangible results. Investments in EVs and battery production solidified the country's position as a leader in sustainable manufacturing. Workforce retraining programs, regional support for SMEs, and long-term incentives ensured that disruptions did not derail progress. Canada turned disruption into direction, balancing industrial policy with social stability, and demonstrating that measured long-term strategy often outperforms short-term pressure. In a world of industrial uncertainty, Canada's model emphasizes foresight, resilience, and sustainable growth. While U.S. policies rely on immediate impact, Canada's structured approach secures lasting industrial influence, making the nation a hub for innovation, employment, and strategic economic leadership. The lesson is clear. The future belongs to those who plan, adapt, and build infrastructure, not those who react impulsively to tariffs or political headlines.